You're listening to the Deloitte Business Chemistry Confessions podcast series. Welcome to this week's episode of Deloitte Business Chemistry Confessions. In this series, you'll hear from executives about their perspectives on the CXO role and how it all comes down to one thing: business chemistry. The world today is shifting and changing faster than ever. Talent, systems, and cultures are constantly in flux. It can be difficult for anyone to manage, but leaders especially need to be at the forefront of these new realities. Steve Schloss, CHRO and Chief People Officer of the USGA, spoke with us about how he manages to lead ahead of the curve. He emphasizes that today's leaders need to be curious, lifelong learners with a willingness to adapt. Hear his unique thoughts in today's episode, Inspired Leadership.
There are four things that I've tended to see and be a part of or engage around when it comes to what are the elements of leadership that people struggle with, or if they were able to really be fully formed, what do they need to do better? And I would describe them as conscious leadership, connected leadership, informed leadership, and influential leadership. And let me explain what I mean by that in terms of what I've come across. When it comes to conscious leadership, and I'm working with leaders both as a pro bono coach, but also as someone who's worked with leaders of all types in all phases and all sizes of organizations, conscious leadership simply means is to the degree to which people are self-aware and are unafraid to ask for feedback and understand how to manage emotion and behaviors, because that alone is a big issue in the workplace. But it's also the ability to adapt to situations and demonstrate that individuals can be adaptable in the way they make decisions and communicate and address behaviors to achieve certain results. And understanding that actions in some ways are more important than the words that they're saying, although words are powerful, and ultimately, modeling certain behavior. And so that's conscious leadership. When it comes to connected leadership, probably more so than any other area, this is probably the behavior that people struggle the most with, which is building and nurturing relationships and how you go about cultivating that over the long term, whether it's based on trust and candor and empathy and listening, but understanding how to value differences in others and being inclusive, but at the same time also enabling and facilitating debate. Those capabilities lead to people being more connected leaders. And what I find is people don't spend the time that they should in nurturing those relationships. And those are relationships within the organization, amongst your team, amongst those you lead, to your customers and partners. That is, in some ways, I spent an enormous amount of time doing so with very intentional reasons, not only just to get to know people, but to help us move the organization forward. The third is what I describe as informed leadership. And to me, this is one of those things where it's not hard to do, it's just your choice. And that is really demonstrating and understanding how the organization you're a part of operates, whether it's financially, customers, measures of success, drivers, and that the impact on long and short-term decisions and strategies, but also being more aware of the world around you and the intersection of knowledge and culture and values and history, politics, the environment, and becoming more contextually driven as a decision maker so that you have the ability to be an informed member at the leadership table, to be able to weigh in on discussions and topics that, while you may not be the expert, because you don't need to be the expert sitting at the leadership table, but you certainly should have perspective. That's something, being an informed leader is fundamental, especially in an environment where the world is changing so dramatically. And lastly is the notion of being influential. And to me, the ability to bring clarity to the work environment, and whether it's setting strategy and messaging and leading organizations through systemic change, and using the power of inspiration and being inspiring as a leader is something that, again, takes a certain degree of inner confidence and comfort. And again, one of the key things here is how effective are you as a leader or as an emerging leader in the simple capability of presenting, listening, but even more so facilitating discussion, and being seen as someone who has the ability to get the right people together to make the best possible outcome possible. And recognizing that in some ways great ideas come from everyone. So whether it's being influential, informed, connected, or conscious, those are the four things that I have seen and that I've experienced over many years in the role that I'm in.
So I think it's interesting listening to the four aspects of leadership that he's highlighting here, because being a conscious leader is essentially about being self-aware. Connected is really about nurturing relationships and taking the time to invest in those relationships. The informed part is really about context and perspective. And then the influential part is really about clarity of message and inspiration. And what I find fascinating about those four things is that those are actually all very integratory kinds of things, even though, as we've seen from the CXO study, integrator is not one of the most represented patterns within the C-suite.
It's kind of interesting that, we've got, pioneers and drivers tending to be the most common types in the C-suite. And he's seen leaders struggle with this very integratory type of behavior.
The other one that is a struggle for pioneers in particular, this self-aware. I mean, pioneers don't tend to be, I'm a pioneer, I can say this, they don't tend to be very self-aware. They're not doing a lot of inner reflection and let's really dissect every little meaning of this. Same, I would argue, with drivers. So those two patterns that we're seeing most dominant in the C-suite are really challenged with a lot of these qualities that he's describing as being key to a successful leader.
At the same time, I do think that, a lot of these behaviors can be really embraced by any of the types. I mean, any of the types could focus on, well, how do I become more self-aware? And any of the types could ask for feedback, and any of the types could learn about the world around them. I think the behaviors themselves are not necessarily challenging for any of the types. It's whether it's their natural inclination to think of doing them. And I think that sometimes that's why a framework like this is so helpful, is it reminds us, we see ourselves in certain parts of it and not so much in others. And it reminds us what are the things that maybe aren't as natural that could help make us better leaders.
That's right. And the other angle on this is how you come at these different things. So if I know that context is important, for instance, or getting perspectives, am I the person who's going to go out and network with a ton of people to hear what's going on in the world and drive a more social approach to getting that information? Or am I somebody who's really going to dig into the latest news or research findings and really debate topics and challenge some of the things that are coming out in the news? I mean, that is a very different approach to ending up in the same zone of context and perspective.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to why are we on leadership teams, right? We don't just lead all by ourselves, because, for any one person to do all of this stuff is a lot. And as you say, there are multiple ways to do any one of them. So when we bring people together that have those different natural inclinations, and maybe you have gone out and talked to a lot of people, and I read a lot of books about it. And when we bring that together, it just makes it so much richer for all of us.
Part of being an effective leader is being able to constantly adapt to the changing environment, which means not only understanding how you yourself may need to react differently to drive these different aspects of the framework, but also how you may need to evolve the way that you think about these things as the environment changes around you.
I do think, and what we're trying to do here is help people become both agile and resilient as we affect change and respond to change. And one of the things that we believe in and are trying to help people understand is that to be agile and to be resilient, there are what we'll define as 4 continuums by which an individual needs to learn to navigate each and every day. And so, for example, we want people to be personally agile as an individual while helping others become more agile, and the same thing about being personally resilient and helping others be resilient. The second is understanding the impact of being agile inside the organization and how to be agile externally, and the same thing in terms of how do you help the organization be resilient and how do you help others around that you're serving become resilient. The third is how do you be both tactically and strategically agile as well as tactically and strategically resilient. And the fourth is how do you address change both agile and resilience-wise, and that is change on one end of the spectrum being incremental change through the lens of continuous improvement to disruptive change, which is really breakthrough thinking and reinvention. So the notion of self versus others, internal versus external, tactical versus strategic, incremental versus disruptive, connected to the notion of being agile and resilient, that's what we're focused on and helping our leaders evolve towards. And I do think that's a reflection on where I think people need to be redirecting and focusing their leadership efforts in today's world.
One of the interesting things that he's pointing out here with these spectrums are that you can't just be in one place. There is a need to sort of go back and forth between these ends, whether we're talking about whether you're helping yourself or others, whether it's internal or external things, whether it's tactical or strategic. There's not like there's a single right answer. And I think that plays very well with the message of business chemistry because you have your own natural style. There's a spectrum of styles that spreads to the other end of where you are. And you actually can't afford to just stay in your own style. That isn't the right answer in every circumstance. And so knowing when and how to flex or when and how to engage other people in order to have a balance there is really important.
I agree. And the way he lays it all out here, though, sounds like a very tall order. So it's not easy to flex in all directions all of the time. And, maybe it sounds like an even taller order to me as a guardian who sort of likes to do things in a specific way. But I also think that, even when we hear the words agility and resilience, I tend to think a little bit more of the pioneer. That, well, that's natural for them. And so maybe tough luck for the rest of us. But this part of the reason I love this framework is it's so specific. It makes it clear, first of all, that it's not enough to be resilient or agile yourself. If you're a leader, you need to help other people do that. And that's not easy even for a pioneer to do, probably. And in some ways, it might be even harder for a pioneer to help other people figure out how to do that. I think back to, I grew up as a competitive swimmer, and, if I try to teach someone to swim, I don't know how to teach them to swim. I just tell them you just swim. That's how you do it. And for a pioneer to teach someone else how to be agile is sort of like, well, you just flex and change and adapt. So I think that also speaks to the power of us all trying to do this together and figure it out together.
And it begs the question, as a leader, does everyone need to flex to the same degree and in the same way, including yourself, right? Do you look for opportunities to flex where it's easier to flex and to maybe not have as much change in either parts of the organization or individuals where that creates a greater challenge? Ultimately, I think what you need is a balance across these things, whether that balance is equally distributed against every individual.
Yeah, and I do think, it's clear there's space for everyone in here. I mean, the fact that he talks about being both tactically and strategically agile and resilient, well, often it's not the same people who would be focusing on the strategy and focusing on the tactics. So there's room for multiple types there. The fact that we're talking about both disruptive change and incremental change, again, possibly different people who would be focused in those different places. And so it's really a framework that leaves space for all of the types and all of the approaches.
Most importantly, a leader needs to connect with his team to inspire great work. And Steve actually goes on to talk about what this means cross-culturally.
Well, to be sure, anyone who desires to be a CXO of any type really needs to learn to navigate each of the four quadrants of the chemistry assessment as far as I'm concerned. And the truth is, we all have dominant strengths. We need to learn to be adaptive and agile and resilient. And in today's fast-moving, digitally connected business environment, that lack of leadership dexterity assures you that you'll probably likely have real little sustainable and positive impact. And so, part of it is there are differences depending upon industries and cultures and leader team types. The true meaning of leading a global effort was understanding what it means to be truly cross-culturally competent and fundamentally to do one thing particularly well, which is just to listen.
Steve brings up an interesting point here because we talk, of course, all the time about individual working styles, but there are also cultural differences that come through either in an organization that adds yet another dimension to the dynamic.
Yeah, and it sometimes becomes difficult to try to overlay those things, Oh, well, now I have to think about cultural diversity and cognitive diversity and gender diversity. And pretty soon, it can get very complicated. And sometimes having a framework like business chemistry can sort of help, I think, to be an overlay on top of all of those things and sort of a common way of talking about differences that people can use to help bridge some of that.
It also helps, I think, because the point isn't so much exactly what type somebody is. The point is to be paying attention, observing what are the clues, what are the things they're doing, what are some of these reference points that might help me to get a better sense of how I could interact with them and how I might flex my style. And Steve makes this point. I mean, he's very much emphasizing that you have to listen. And listening comes in many forms. It's not just literal listening with your ears, but it's observing, watching. What's the body language? What are the nonverbals? What are some of these other cultural signals, perhaps, that will give me a better clue about how to engage?
It's a great reminder that there are differences, that we need to pay attention to what they are.
Part of being a leader here, as he's describing it, is being multidimensional, as he says. And that's fascinating because we talk a lot about the primary styles that people have, sometimes primary, secondary. But the reality is that people are made up of these four patterns. They have many different dimensions that they can call upon. And so even if it's not their natural style or the thing that they're inclined to play to, the metaphor we often use is actual music and orchestras. Just having lots of different instruments playing all at the same time does not necessarily result in a beautiful, harmonious sound. You actually have to orchestrate it. You have to be thinking about how the pieces come together and, make sure that the piccolo isn't drowned out by the tuba. Those are really important things in a team. And the expression he used that I thought was very powerful is sustainable positive impact. I actually think it's easy for many teams to lean into a dominant style and for leaders to play to their dominant style for a period of time. And they might get very good results for a period of time. But as the world changes, as things change, they're not going to be able to sustain that. So to really get that lasting impact, you do need to not only recognize, but harness that power of diversity. The confession is in. Inspired leadership shows that being flexible in your style can help you evolve as a leader. Be sure to tune in for our next episode. And if you'd like to hear more stories and thoughts from today's leaders, you can also check out Deloitte's award-winning Resilient podcast. Find both on Deloitte.com, Stitcher, or Apple's podcast app.
This podcast is provided by Deloitte and is intended to provide general information only. This podcast is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, go to Deloitte.com/about.